Jeff Johnson, I can't believe we're finally seeing each other after all of these years. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon. The listeners know that inspiration and teachers, is really kind of like how we kind of came into being with working with our own students. And as I said in the intro, you are one of those who inspired me. And even though I didn't end up in the science realm, I kind of did in large part because of your influence. So will you share a little bit with our listeners today about how you became a teacher, how you love space, and just kind of where you ended up with STEM?
Well, space was really good timing for me because I was a little kid when the space program was just getting started, and NASA was being funded very well in the 60s. We had Mercury, we had Gemini, we had Apollo. There were lots of unmanned rockets. In fact, NASA would launch rockets to crash onto the moon. That was the Ranger series. And they would take pictures every couple seconds showing the moon closer and closer and closer. Then the satellite would crash into the moon. And that would be in the front page of the paper the next day. So that's how big space was back then. Everybody was fascinated by it. So it was a great time to be growing up. And I started making a scrapbook when John Glenn went into orbit, and everything about space intrigued me. And the classroom teachers at the time, they were all ramped up to teach you about space too. And I had great junior high teachers that really inspired me to be into science even more than I already was. Becoming a teacher did not come to me naturally. My high school teachers in science weren't that great. So I was a journalism major and ultimately a wildlife biology major. I was trying all sorts of different things. And, I liked what I was doing, but I really didn't have a career. And then this very serendipitous event occurred. I was at a softball game. I was an undergraduate, and I was sitting next to a guy who had just graduated from college with a degree in English, and he couldn't even get a job at a department store. So he decided to go back and get his teaching certificate. And for the first time in my life, I thought, teaching, that sounds like a pretty cool thing. And so I changed my major, and a year later, I was doing student teaching at a junior high in Missouri, and I loved it. I fell in love with the work. I fell in love with the kids. I fell in love with the whole prospect of helping kids to become more excited about science. And one thing led to another. I moved to Wisconsin. I got a job at a high school where there were some really talented chemistry teachers, and I became their kind of mentee. And I learned so much from being around these experts. And I became a chemistry teacher, and I did that for years, and ultimately became an AP chemistry teacher. And my career took several twists and turns after that. I didn't stay in classroom teaching forever. I got into technology and retired recently. So I had a long and interesting and exciting career as a teacher. I made many great friends of former students like Shauna, and I'm still in touch with a lot of them, which I love.
That's been really great for me too. Like when you think back, there are only a few teachers that, especially now that it is, as you said, a different age, right? Like we have cell phones now, or we're on social media. So I keep in touch with a few teachers, but very, very few. And I just think we just didn't have that kind of connection then. So what are some of your favorite memories, I guess, from let's say the science classroom, or how you got kids? Like, do you have any great stories to share?
Well, when I was your teacher at Newberry, um, we didn't really have lab facilities. So most of the experiments that we did were in the form of demonstrations where we would collect data in front of the class. And, I would call students up to read a thermometer or, weigh something. And then we would kind of have class data. And that was about as good as we could do back then. I think part of my success as a teacher was that I think my students knew that I liked what I was doing. And I wasn't just standing up there to talk. I really wanted to get people excited. When I became a chemistry teacher in Wisconsin, these guys that were my mentors were very hands-on, and we were doing lab experiments all the time. We were doing demonstrations that were considered far too dangerous to do now. For example, we would do what's called a thermite experiment, where you mix powdered iron oxide or iron oxide and powdered aluminum together, and you ignite the reaction and it forms liquid iron. I don't think anybody does that as a demo anymore, but we did it all the time.
Right.
So one of my students walked up to me one day and said, "You really like to blow stuff up, don't you, Mr. Johnson?" I said, "Hey, that's why I'm a chemistry teacher. I like to blow stuff up."
Kevin has a background in chemistry
So,
too.
yes, I'm a biochemist and chemist by schooling. So
Sure.
I was in industry and research and then ended up teaching, but working in all those practical experiences really paid off. For instance, a thermite grenade, you just set them on an engine block and keep moving and they melt through the engine.
Right.
That's how hot it is. And so I can't believe that anyone would ever allow that to happen in a classroom. That we barely got to do that in the Army. So very interesting. I want to ask you a couple of questions. One, all the way back to your Ranger. When you're a kid, you're looking at the Ranger missions.
Right.
Did you know then that they were worried that the soil, it might be so powdery on the moon that they would sink? And were you aware of that as a kid, or was it just shock and awe, just the awesomeness of what was happening?
Well, I think it was both. I think when I was really young, it was just the fascination of doing something outside of Earth. And, you know, you read about it. There's a lot of science fiction that I read as a kid. But then the more practical aspects of preparing to go to the moon with people, they really had a lot of unanswered questions. They didn't know what would happen. And one of the things that I was always curious about was, did any of the Apollo missions get close enough to any of the crash sites where they could see what happened to the Ranger probes or the Lunar Explorer probes? I think that they saw some of them while they're in orbit, but I'm not sure if they ever got up to any of them close and personal.
I do think one of the Apollo missions was they were within walking or rover distance from one of the Rangers, but don't hold me to that.
Yeah.
Quick, I know you have some interesting life experiences when it came to interacting with NASA. Would you share a little bit about how you got to, scratch the space itch with your NASA experiences?
It was really an unbelievable thing. It was the last day of school after my first year of teaching, and I was in the department chair's classroom. We were just chewing the fat, and I looked at his wastebasket, and there was an envelope from NASA. And of course, NASA, I had written to NASA many times as a kid and received packets of information and posters and some handwritten letters from people at NASA. So anyway, I grabbed this piece of mail out of the trash can and I opened it up, and it said, NASA was offering workshops for math and science teachers, and the deadline to apply was the next day, whatever the next day was. And so I asked the department chair, because I had to get a letter of reference. I said, "Would you sign a letter of reference for me?" And he said, "Sure." So I filled it out and sent it in. And I thought, well, there's no way that I'm going to get in. And a week or two later, I got an acceptance letter to go to a 2-week workshop called NUMAST, the NASA Educational Workshop for Math and Science Teachers at Kennedy Space Center. And here I am teaching in Florida. I get to go to the Space Center, something that I've dreamt about since I was a kid. And I did. I went, and not only was it a great experience, but we got paid. We got a stipend, and we got graduate credit. We got to meet astronauts. We got to go on the shuttle assembly facility where they were gearing up the Challenger for the next mission. We got to see shuttle launches from closer than the public can see it. And I made many friends that I stayed in touch with for years. So that was a pinch me, I can't believe it moment.
Right.
And, yeah, really lucky and fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. If I wouldn't have looked in the wastebasket that day, it would have never happened.
It's funny, when we work with teachers, and having been a teacher now for, gosh, more than 20 years, a lot of that in the public sector, I find that a lot of teachers in general kind of just get downtrodden, and they're just there doing the curriculum. They're staying in the classroom almost because they're forced to. But what we've been able to do is to kind of help them to see with that paradigm shift of what can you do about taking some opportunities. So I love that you took an opportunity that was there. You didn't just let it pass you by, and you went beyond the classroom.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, and that was really good too, because the next year, the first year I taught, I had to teach 3 social studies classes, which, I mean, I took the job just to get my foot in the door. It was my first teaching job. But the next year I became the 8th grade science teacher, and I did that for the next year when you were my student. And just having that experience of being at NASA got me so jazzed and so fired up to get people excited about that. And then, of course, the year that you were in my class, that was the year the Challenger blew up.
Yep.
And we were doing science research projects for the science fair. We were walking back from the main building to our classroom, and somebody, I think, noticed a funny colored cloud in the sky. And then the assistant principal got on the PA a little while later and said, you may have heard a rumor that the space shuttle exploded, and it's true. And we were just like stunned.
Yeah.
Right.
Those, moments.
I remember that announcement. Actually, I was but at that point we were done with your class. We had gone back to the gym. So I was in PE, and I just remember, and again, maybe it's just childhood recollection. I'm wrong about half of my memories, it seems like, anymore, but I just remember everything getting quiet and the balls kind of like almost in a movie, just kind of dribbling, because we were doing basketball shooting and just kind of dribbling over the side.
I was in high school. I remember exactly that moment. I was in the cafeteria, and I remember that January 28th. Fast forward some years later, I actually had students at the Cocoa Beach Hilton preparing proteins to go up on the Discovery that summer when the Columbia was supposed to pass overhead, and that was the day the Columbia broke up. So, the shuttle has such a beautiful history of both, so many triumphs and victories, and yet two of the 5 vehicles were completely lost. I want to pivot real quickly. When you talked about being in the classroom, you were pre-internet, as with some of these experiences you shared. Would you say, despite having larger classrooms, say, than some of us today, that you had more of maybe a captive audience and there were less distractions than maybe perhaps what's going on today?
Well, definitely less distractions. I mean, I've wondered out loud about what it would be like to be a classroom teacher where 25 people have cell phones.
Well, the good, the bad, right? You have
Yeah.
you have access to almost all the knowledge in the world, and no one with the wisdom to know what to do with it. So
yeah, and right when schools started to incorporate technology, schools were wired for not only wide area network in their classrooms, but they got connected to the internet. In fact, the high school that I taught at had a 1 dial-up line as our initial internet connection. And that was a very unusual time. So I did change my career a little bit at that point. I went from being a classroom teacher to being a technology guy. And I tried to get other people as excited about using technology as I was, which was no easy feat. There were lots of reluctant adopters of technology, but kids were never reluctant. They were on fire to use new technology. And it would actually be fun now to do projects with kids, and with the idea of maybe designing something that could go into space, or be a real research project that the real world could use. I would really love it.
There are a number of programs that exist. They have some stuff called citizen scientists programs, where you can take large data sets, for instance, from telescopes or other scientific instruments, and you can actually try to ferret out, learn something new and contribute. You can also use your laptop when it's on idle to, run search for anomalies in the sky. I think about there's probably 25 programs where students today can interact with the space station and the research that's going on there. I just want to ask one question, and I hear it in your voice. I have been a NASA junkie I wrote NASA from the foothills of North Carolina with stamps and envelopes and they would send me the lithographs, the technical summaries, the things that you described. Those were exciting times because that was as close to NASA as I could get, was writing them in the 70s and getting them to mail me something. Wouldn't you agree? And can you elaborate on just about the inspirational aspect that NASA can offer, not only young adults, but especially young kids? From your seat, what you saw being the, excited about NASA and with your students, what could you say to the inspirational factor of the space program?
Well, I think, first of all, we've got a lot of great teachers out there that are doing things like you guys are doing to get kids excited and realize that they could have careers, maybe not flying into space, but certainly working with colleges, universities, other organizations that are designing experiments that might go into space. There's a lot of kids that are doing that. I know that when the total eclipse occurred a few years ago, there were no shortage of citizen participation. Yes. Experiments launching balloons that would go up and take pictures so you could actually see the sphere of the moon's shadow as it went across the United States. So I think that there's just more opportunities than ever for kids to be involved. And I think it just takes an excited teacher, some excited adults, some supportive parents, clearly a supportive school district to make those things happen. And right. They are happening. You guys are doing it.
Well, yeah, I mean, Kevin, again, I came to it as the debate coach. His kids were building cube satellites in middle school, and I didn't know what that meant. I'm assuming someone in aerospace is just going to be an astronaut, of course. Come to find out, after all these years of working with him and his students, no, like the trip that we took to MIT, for example, I had no idea that engineers could sit around with Legos, for example, at the MIT labs. But you want to share a little bit about what you do with the high altitude balloons and the CubeSats?
Sure. Our kids love to launch these high altitude balloons, and we have a radio that talks to the global star network of satellites. And the reason we use that radio is it's very similar to the radio that we fly in space, and you can get all of your data on a dashboard. So you're not required to have line of sight with your radio and get the data. So we have GPS, altitude, telemetry, all sorts of telemetry, voltages, temperatures, etc., and where you are over the surface of the earth. And it comes to us on basically a dashboard through the internet. So all I have to do is share the password and everybody gets all the data, on our team. And then we also do a live video camera. As long as we have line of sight and it's not too turbulent, we can get a live video feed of what our balloon sees. So we try to do those a couple of times a year. The kids love them. Now we have this big buoy that once the balloon bursts, it floats in the ocean, and we slow down the telemetry rate and then track the balloon buoy as the Gulf Stream normally takes it due north. So we have, tremendous fun with that.
What he's not telling you is that it's not like he gets clearance or anything. He basically just picks up the phone and says, "Hey, PS Police Department, I'm about to launch a balloon. Bye."
Yeah, it's probably for clarity for our viewers, the weight and size of our balloon is allowed, and we tend to be very cautious with our simulations. There's great websites. We run sims to make sure we don't get near any airports and things like that. So we are very cautious about that. I want to pivot right back to, you said it. I think people like you, a teacher that had a heart for the subject, right? Enthusiasm creates an environment where kids can be very excited, right? It's like green lights their excitement, right? You're like validating them to go chase down, we call it blue sky learning. Find a ridiculous goal, whatever you want to do, and then just run it down. Just go do it. I think that's the key. Maybe even more so. You got to be technically competent, but the enthusiasm cannot be understated. I think how valuable that is to help young people, chase their dreams.
I agree completely. And I think, reflecting back on being a teacher and now being friends with my former students as adults, I think one of the things that you guys realized as students was that I really liked what I was doing. I really liked hanging around with you guys. I mean, you might think people are crazy if they say that they like being an 8th grade teacher, but I loved it. It was fantastic. And I think that was a great way for me to get started too. I think a lot of good things happened. A lot of the right things lined up for me. And then landing in a school district in Wisconsin where I was mentored by these 3 career chemistry teachers that forgot more about chemistry than I would ever know was
Right.
a fantastic thing. Yeah.
How
And then
was
taking advantage of that.
right? How was transitioning to the Wisconsin winter from the Florida winter?
Well, I grew up in Minnesota.
I was going to say, I think
Oh.
you were from there. I think I knew that.
So
accent.
ice fishing is sort of like your weekend pastime.
Well, I didn't do a lot of ice fishing, but where I grew up, most kids learned to skate around the time they learned to walk
Okay.
because there were outdoor rinks and the winter was cold enough. And who knows with the future of climate change if that'll be true. But in skating, everything's indoors now anyway.
Sure. Well, it's obvious you love the cold weather because you retired to New Mexico.
Well, plus I'm at 6,000 feet.
Oh, okay. So you have snow.
Yeah, today it's 58 degrees.
Oh,
Tonight
wow.
tonight we're getting a freeze, and I'm actually pretty far south. I'm only an hour and a half north of the U.S.-Mexico border, but at
Okay.
6,000 feet, it gets chilly.
So are you near Holloman Air Force Base?
I don't think so. I'm about 2 hours from White Sands Missile Range.
Okay.
And I know that there's, I don't know if it's SpaceX, one of the private rocket launching firms has a New Mexico base. And so once we start launching more from here, I'll be there.
Excellent. I believe Bezos is in West Texas and Musk is in, on the Gulf. I know that they used to have something called the X Prize, and I went out to Holloman Air Force Base one time for a big X Prize event. But man, there's so much history of rocketry, spacecraft in the Southwest of the U.S.
Well, one of the things that I love about being here is the skies are totally dark at night. So last night I went out and my eyes didn't even have to adjust. You could see the Milky Way.
Right.
That's
So
pretty great.
I'm getting a telescope.
I want to ask you a technology question as we're going to be wrapping up here soon, but you were kind of at the advent of that in education, the idea of bringing the computers and the internet in the classroom, and you worked on programming and things along those lines. And I know that you said it was difficult to get some buy-in. When you look back now and you think about where we are, what do you think might be the biggest benefit of having an educational, component with technology, or maybe even the worst? So the best and the worst of how technology may have implemented or affected the curriculum.
Well, I guess I'm still naive enough to think that having access to all of the internet resources that we have is a plus. I mean, there's a lot of distractions, and it's changed obviously with the politicalization and the commercialization of the internet. But there's unlimited resources for teachers. For example, I recently started mentoring the daughter of another one of my former students who's taking organic chemistry as part of her nursing program. And she was having trouble understanding geometric isomerism, 3D molecules. Everything's drawn on paper. I said, go out and get yourself some gumdrops and toothpicks, make yourself some molecules. Then after you understand the whole 3D nature of things, you can eat them. And I also sent her some websites that she can use so that she can understand this, because, a generation or two ago, you couldn't do that. There weren't websites, and
Right.
Understanding things 3D, unless you actually had models, was very difficult. So I think technology is generally a huge plus for teachers. It's just, it's a whole different way of teaching than what I used to do. I almost wish that I was doing it still, because I think I would have a lot of fun.
You mentioned that about things like isomerism or chirality. I was talking about left and right-handed molecules, and I drew something on the board, and the kids quickly found a page where you could take molecules and with a mouse, with a touchpad, you could rotate in all the dimensions and see, a 3D view of it. So my last question for you is a simple one. Bradbury Heinlein, Star Trek, Star Wars. Let's hear what your favorites in that bunch were. You grew up in a generation where you saw Star Trek firsthand, right? Were you a Trekker? What are your thoughts on Star Wars versus Star Trek?
Well, Star Wars was a TV show, and back when it came on in mid 60s, basically most people had 4 channels. They had the 3 primary networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC, and maybe an educational channel, maybe an independent channel. So everybody watched the same thing. You only had 2 or 3 choices. And so Star Trek was the first of its genre that, made fantastic science available to everybody as a storytelling. Star Wars took it to another level because now you're in space, the special effects and so forth. But frankly, you mentioned Heinlein and Asimov and those guys. That's what I ate up, is reading those guys. And those were the most fantastic stories. And of course, I loved the movies and the TV shows, but I loved the writers. In fact, this is a true story. 2001 was written and produced as a movie at the same time. Kubrick and Arthur Clarke were co-developing it. And I remember seeing that movie in the theater, and I still think it's one of the best movies, not only science fiction, but best movies ever made. And I wrote Arthur Clarke a letter, and it was months later, maybe years, I don't know. But he wrote me back. He lived on the island of Ceylon. It was known then in Sri Lanka now. And he wrote me back. And that is still one of my favorite things that I've hung on to all these years, is a personal letter from Arthur Clarke.
That's incredible.
If you send us a digitized picture of it, we can put it with this.
I'll share it on that.
That's very cool. Arthur C. Clarke.
I've got about 100 boxes.
Yes, no, they just moved.
I'll find it and I'll send it to you.
I appreciate that. So many great Arthur C. Clarke. Oh my goodness, Ray Bradbury.
See, I'm of a different. It's like my first exposure to sci-fi literature was Vonnegut, but I would then reread Slaughterhouse-Five over and over and over again, and go on to read most of his other works as well in high school.
Yeah, Will Vonnegut's one of the great American writers, that's for sure.
Love him. Our final question always is, if you have some advice for either our students listening, or we have some now in university, just about whether it's about school or life in general, what advice do you have or even teachers?
Yeah, or educators.
Yeah, because we have educators too. Yeah.
Yeah. What can you share based on your data so far?
Well, I just say try to find opportunities out there, especially outside the school year, where you can go and get some additional experience or learning. It's something that's not just a graduate course, but a workshop where you can maybe work with real scientists or collaborate on something. I know that the guys that were my chemistry teacher mentors, they all came of age right when NASA was big, and they were all funded for their graduate degrees by Department of Defense grants. Mm-hmm. And so they all got their graduate degrees paid for. One of the guys I worked with, every summer he would go to Bell Labs and spend the whole summer there, all expenses paid. They'd put him and his family up. He got paid, he got graduate credit, and he got to have experiences that weren't available. So I would say go out there and find something and be creative and write letters and ask questions and make phone calls. There's plenty of people out there that are interested in working with teachers and kids. Yeah. And you just got to find them.
Thank you.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. And it was so nice to be able to see your face through technology.
It's really great to talk to you guys too. And it's nice to see you.
Thank you.